So we're going to talk about photosynthesis. First, we're going to just start by going through the simple equation, and then we're going to talk more specifics about how this process actually works and break it down into the two stages, which is the light stage and the dark stage. So first, just the equation. We have the sun, so we need sunlight to do photosynthesis. And by we, I mean plants. We don't really do photosynthesis, but plants do. So the plant needs sunlight, it needs water, which is H2O, and also carbon dioxide. So that's what's going to be needed to do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, the whole point of it is to make food for the plant. And specifically, it makes glucose or sugar. So that's what glucose is a sugar. And then we also, the plants are going to make oxygen as a byproduct. So the three things that are needed are sunlight, water, and CO2. And that's going to make glucose and oxygen. So here's the light stage and the dark stage, and there's a couple of important things that you need to know about this. The first thing is the dark stage cannot run without the light stage. The whole purpose of the light stage is to make these two energy molecules that are going to run this cycle in the dark stage. So you can see we have this cycle over here in the dark stage. So the two energy molecules that are made by the light cycle are NADPH. So NADPH. And then I'm sure you've heard of this molecule, ATP. That's like the money of the cells. All of our cells use energy mainly in the form of ATP. So these two molecules are the whole purpose of the light stage, is to make those two molecules, because they're going to go over to the dark stage and they're going to allow that cycle to run so the dark stage can produce what the plant wants, which is glucose. So here's our product, our end product that is wanted from photosynthesis, and it's going to be made in the dark stage, but it can't be made unless the light stage makes these two energy molecules. So please remember that. It's very important. It's the link between the light stage and the dark stage. Now, if we write out the formula for glucose, it's C8 or C6H12O6. And I've said many times the element of life is carbon. You have to have carbon. So glucose is an organic molecule, so it has to have that carbon, and it does. But the plants need to get that carbon from somewhere. So this is where CO2 is going to come into the picture, because CO2 has carbon in it. It's carbon dioxide. And this carbon is what's going to be used to provide the carbon for that glucose. So you can remember that CO2 has to come into the dark stage because that's where the carbon is going to be brought in. We don't need CO2 in the light stage because we don't need carbon then. We only need it in the dark stage. But if we go back to the light cycle, in order to make these two high energy molecules, NADPH and ATP, we're going to need two things to make that, and that's where the other two things for photosynthesis come in. So here's the sun. Okay, so that's the light energy, and then the last thing is left is H2O. So if you look, we have the three things again that plants need to do photosynthesis. We have sunlight, we have water, and we have CO2. Sunlight and water are used in the light stage. Obviously light needs to be used in the light stage, and I'm going to explain soon why water is needed. And then CO2, because of that carbon, is what's needed in the dark stage to make glucose. And if you can remember, other than glucose, the other thing that's made from photosynthesis is oxygen. And that's actually going to be made in the light stage. So there's our oxygen. Now I want to go back to these high energy molecules, because this again is the link between the light stage and the dark stage. This NADPH and ATP. But we have this kind of empty space up here above it. And that's what's going to be recycled back to the light stage, because you have this cycle that goes back and forth between the light stage and the dark stage. So when the dark stage uses the NADPH and the ATP, it's actually going to send back what it used to be remade again. And it sends back NADP, which, as you notice, it's missing that H. So really when this NADPH comes over to the dark stage, that H is popped off, which is going to release energy to help spin that cycle. And then the dark cycle sends NADP back to the light stage to be made again. And all the light stage has to do is add an H on there. So it's this nice little cycle. So let's talk about ATP, and I'm going to draw it over here. So ATP, just a very simple model, is an A with 3 phosphates on it. Okay? That's what the T stands for, is triphosphate, 3 phosphates. There's also a form of ATP that's called ADP because it's missing one of those phosphates. So it has 2 phosphates. So that is diphosphate, which is 2. So you got ATP that has 3, ADP which has 2. If we go back over here, ADP is what's going to be sent back to the light stage. So really all that happened over in the dark stage was ATP lost one of its phosphates, which released a ton of energy. So the dark stage sends ADP back to the light stage to just add on another phosphate. So this works out really nicely because we're not having to build up a whole molecule of NADPH or ATP. We're not having to build something. The plants just have to add on either a hydrogen on NADP or a phosphate onto ATP or ADP. So it's really easy to make these energy molecules in the light stage, so it kind of cycles through, which is kind of nice. So that's just the summary of how the light stage and the dark stage work. You should have this whole thing memorized. You should completely understand this. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the light stage and how we make these molecules, this NADPH and ATP. How is this made in the light stage? So right now we're just focusing on the light stage. Well, we have to have a membrane for this to happen. So I'm going to draw a really quick membrane. I'm not going to draw it all the way across the page. This is basically what we did in class. So remember, it's a double membrane. You got those heads and those tails. The tails face inward because they're very hydrophobic and they don't like to touch water. So they're hidden in the inside there. And I'm just going to draw a shorthand across. I'm just going to draw a line instead of drawing all the phospholipids all the way across. So we're going to be drawing more stuff, and I need to keep it simple. But just so you know, this is a double membrane here. So this double membrane in the light stage is going to have some proteins in it. Okay, and we're just going to draw one set of these, and there's going to be 4 proteins in this electron transport chain. And you have to think that there's a bunch of these all throughout the membrane. We're just going to focus on one set of 4 proteins. All right, so here's our 4 proteins that are sitting inside the membrane. Now, we talked in the last slide that the light stage requires light from the sun, obviously, because it's the light stage, and it also requires H2O, and there's a reason for that. Because what's going to happen is the sunlight's going to shine down, and it's actually going to break apart this H2O molecule. Because all that solar energy from the sun is going to break apart the water. Now, water has covalent bonds in it. And bonds are made from electrons. So water obviously has electrons in it. And this is important because when water is broken apart, these electrons are actually popped out and they actually go over to these proteins. These proteins really like electrons. So this water, when it's broken apart, these electrons fly out and they go over to this protein. But all these proteins like electrons. So it's actually going to transport down to each protein. It's just going to bounce to the next protein in the chain. That's why it's called the electron transport chain, because these electrons are transported from protein to protein. But at the end, after the 4th protein, there's nowhere for the electrons to go. So what happens is there's these NADPs floating around. Remember, we just talked about these. They were sent back from the dark cycle. It's actually going to take one of these electrons, and then it's going to grab a hydrogen. So let's say a hydrogen's here. It's going to grab that hydrogen when it takes that electron. This is how we form NADPH. So now we got one of our energy molecules. All that happens is it collects that last electron at the end of the chain. That's how it's made. And you don't need to know exactly how it's made. You just need to know that it accepts that last electron, which is going to form NADPH. So there's one of our energy molecules we need. But we also need ATP. So how's that made? Well, like I said, there's these hydrogens floating around. And they actually have a positive charge. They're hydrogen protons. What's cool is each time one of these electrons is passed to one of these proteins in the chain, these proteins are pumps. And they pump these hydrogens to the other side. So you're going to start getting all these hydrogens. Because every time an electron hits this protein, it pumps hydrogens across. So H+. They're positively charged hydrogens. So eventually we're going to get a lot, sorry, that's supposed to be an H. We're going to get a lot of these hydrogen protons over here. And as we learned in diffusion, they don't like to be really close together. Molecules, they don't like to be crowded, just like you don't like to be crowded in a crowded room. They want to spread out. So where are they going to want to go? Are they going to stay on this side where there's a bunch of protons? No, they're going to want to go to the other side. But remember, they can't cross this membrane because these tails hate charges. So it's not going to let it just cross the membrane. But luckily, there's this channel right next to this little electron transport chain where protons can actually float through due to diffusion. Because remember, diffusion goes from high to low. So these protons naturally want to go to the other side of the membrane. What's also cool is when they travel through this little tunnel, this tunnel is really special because every time a proton goes through there, it somehow makes ATP. So there's our other energy molecule that we had to make. So now we got both of our energy molecules made from the light cycle, and they're going to transfer over to the dark cycle to run that wheel. It's going to spin that wheel. So that's basically how the light stage works, the electron transport chain. Oh, and also, this diffusion process here has a special name, and it's called chemiosmosis. And you've heard the word osmosis. That's the diffusion of water. And rather than diffusion of water, we're talking about the diffusion of a chemical, specifically H+. And that's called chemiosmosis. So we got two processes happening here. We have electron transport chain, and this electron transport chain causes this chemiosmosis process to happen through the pumping of the hydrogens to one side to make them really crowded, and then the diffusion back to the other side. And that results in ATP formation through chemiosmosis. All right, so let's kind of summarize what we talked about. All of these processes we've talked about happen in the chloroplast, which is that organelle in the plant cell. And we're going to talk specifically about two parts. So one is the thylakoid. The thylakoid, and that's what all these little membranes are. All these little stacks here, these are all membranes where the light cycle is going to happen. So the light cycle happens in the region of the chloroplast called the thylakoid. There's also this empty space all around the thylakoid that's pointed to by this arrow, so all this empty space around here, and that's called the stroma. And that's where the dark cycle is going to happen. Okay? All right, so let's talk again about the whole purpose of the light cycle. The whole purpose is to make NADPH and ATP, because that's going to transfer over to the dark cycle. The purpose of the dark cycle, or the dark stage, is to make glucose, which is the whole point of photosynthesis. So the light cycle makes NADPH and ATP, and that's going to give energy to the dark cycle to make glucose, which is what we want. All right, what is used in the light cycle? Well, we use sunlight, because it's the light cycle, and we use water. The dark cycle uses CO2, because remember, we need that carbon to make glucose. That carbon is going to be the carbon that's going to be given to make glucose, so we need CO2 in the dark cycle. And then lastly, let's see if I have some room here to write. Lastly, I want to talk about the two processes that are involved, or the processes that are involved in both of these stages. And I'm actually going to write it above here, just because I don't have any room. So the processes involved in the light cycle are the electron transport chain, okay, or the ETC as it's sometimes called. And also remember, we had that chemiosmosis. We had that diffusion of hydrogen molecules, which is going to make our ATP. And then the dark cycle, it actually has a special name for its process. So that wheel that spins, or that cycle, actually has a special name that's made, that was named after the guy that discovered it. And it's called the Calvin cycle. A lot of students remember it by the Calvin-Klein cycle, however you can remember it, but it's called the Calvin cycle. So that's the name of the process in the dark stage. And remember again, the light cycle happens in these thylakoids because it needs a membrane. Light stage has to have a membrane, like we saw on the previous slide. We have to have a membrane. The dark cycle happens in all this kind of empty space that's around the thylakoids. And both of these are in the chloroplast. They're just different sections of the chloroplasts. All right, so that's all you need to know about these cycles. And there's a lot of keywords here that you need to remember, a lot of details, but hopefully you understand this process, and you can always pause this and rewind it and watch it again until you get it. So hopefully you got it now, and please ask me any questions. Thanks.